please remember that when things get rough, you can always leave over there and come here to Sankofa Books and sit down and relax. Because this is the liberation space and the liberation zone.
I think we are really embarking on a very, very important task. And you know, I am really just a filmmaker, but I also know I travel, I go to many places and I see things that are not existing. And I can also see the whole period of being a year of confusion, especially the African people. As the world becomes global, it looks like our interest is compromised and not looked after by the elite, by the black elite. Here in Africa, in Europe, we seem to be failed. We seem to not have genuine elite that has always historically existed in the African community wherever we were. And so we are really at a dire need to define few things that I think are critical for any living African intellectual. We need to look at where we went wrong, how do we reconfigurate ourselves to embark on a very critical self-centered, and meaning like the African self-centered, Pan-African definition and task, because I think it should go towards activism in the end. And there's nobody else who I feel is more prepared, has done a lifetime work in research to embark us on the first and second installment of what is you and me's responsibility to the Pan-African chapter of our struggle. How do we bridge the Pan-African movement that has existed at a bad time when black folks had economic problem, transportation problem, geographical information problem, and we have more information, there are more PhD black people on the planet, and yet we have no vision that could help us defend ourselves, whatever is inevitable in this historical planet. And so this is the thrust behind today's thing we are embarking. So the first installment is really in the way it is designed, first to see the personal, the whole idea of family, the whole idea of then coming to the collective historical chapter, which I think is very critical because the abstract is so simple. We can always talk about it, but we really don't know how to. And to me, as again a filmmaker, not a historian, a lot of times we seem to be politically very conscious, but unaware of that political's relationship to our personal humanity and how we are as human beings. It looked like politics is one thing, and then we quickly park politics and then quickly become another. So there's this Jekyll and Hyde that I'm seeing, especially on the black elite, because I'm not interested in the other elites. And I think this is the kind of road we need to take. And so the first installment is this, and the second one is we're going to go to how do we then fabricate, if that's the correct word to use, how do we fabricate the new Pan-African movement? How can we make it tangible, realizable, and make it look like water and bread to people now who are now defining everything in a material sense, because in the end that's what it boils down. And then we're going to go after that, to me, with Ackland, because I also feel the next level is the cultural revolution of black people, because we saw black people come to power from here to South Africa. Even if it was like in Oakland, a little black power, or in Chicago, black power, or whatever we call it, and then real black governments in Africa. To me, again, as a filmmaker, I see the cultural revolution has been abdicated or abandoned. And therefore, we have people like Mbeki, which leads me to the Sunday the Saturday, the 7th of June at 3 o'clock, we're doing a thing we call the New South Africa. Is this what we fought for? And this is serious. We're going to show some short films, but then have a town meeting for us to decide how do we respond. Because South Africa's independence has every inch of our blood and sweat in it. And they must not know if they go around killing Africans, specifically Africans, not white people, not Indians, not Asians, but specifically Congolese, specifically Nigerians, Ethiopians, etc. We got to say Zimbabweans now. We got to say something. So put it in your agenda, in your note. The 7th Saturday, and then the 8th, we have a very important thing, and I hope it can complement our lecture here. Paul Coates, classic press brother, has his offsprings now who are writing, which is very important for those of us who are breastfeeding children now. It's good to see a son or a daughter come up with a book. And the brother had written a book, his son, and we're going to make it a pre-Father's Day celebration, having these two men, the son and the father. The son will do copies, he'll sign his books, but the father will put also, be participant into that. And so put that also the 8th at 3 o'clock, and I'm sorry if we're asking you to be part of everything, but to me, this one is really serious. We're investing a whole lot of energy in it, and I hope you don't mind. You will have to sign release at some point, otherwise you can ask us to cut you out, but what we plan to do is then package this to go all the way to Africa, Brazil, subtitled, translated, Pan-African debate, because we don't have the whole answer, we just have the partial frustration. Again, thank you, Uncle Leo. He's Professor Leo, but I keep calling him Uncle, I don't know why.
I think we also should recognize the significance of this historical moment. In the early 1940s, 42 to 46, there was organized in London a group of people just like us, no more than 10 or 12 people, with George Padmore and others, C.L.R. James, Kwame Nkrumah, etc., and they sat down to put together the Manchester City Pan-African Congress. Very important Congress in 1945. When they said that the purpose and the vision of Africa in 1945 was independence in Africa, people around the world laughed at them. The British government, the French government, the Dutch government. 12 people. They sat down and they started to organize African students to come to these meetings, and they had a little room, a little basement place. And that became the historic place which led to 1958, when Ghana got its independence, etc. But there was a body of work that developed out of that. The same thing happened in China in 1918 and 1919. A few people, Zhou Enlai, Mao Zedong, very, very few, about 10 people again, got together and sat down and said, we are going to transform China. Even though there was the Sun Yat-sen revolution of 1905 and 1900, they wanted to see something different. And they moved from 1918 to 1948, trying to work through all the contradictions, the difficulties, the development of a body of knowledge that allowed them in those 30 years to move towards the Long March. So that what we're doing here has the same significance. The question is, we must be determined to do it, not just individually, but collectively. We must come again and again and again so we could draw on the resources. And if Leo tells us we should read A, B, and C, we should go home and read A, B, and C. If he tells us we should commit ourselves that this organization, not in a selfish kind of way to come and absorb it, but that what we're doing here today has its implications over the next 10 years or so, 15 years, in which we will be able to participate in the 21st century, of having provided for people of African descent around the world a vision, a possibility, and a revolution that is certainly different from what we have experienced between 1960 and the present. And if you want to see, you know, when we get to talking about Mbeki and his people, if you read Steve Biko's book, you would really understand what went wrong in South Africa. And Steve Biko's book, I Write What I Want, or something like that, you begin to see that young people were coming together to do this body of work. And they were reading, but then they took out Steve, and it had an enormous impact. And I Write What I Want is right downstairs, you get it there, it's there. But so we must commit to a body of work. There's not coming here for style or show. I've seen everybody in here I know is deadly serious, and I really appreciate the people who have come today.
Yeah.
But we must take what Leo is giving us, because we don't know how long he's going to be here.
And he's also
Yes.
very researched person. This
we
is
must
what
take this very
makes him very
seriously.
credible. I want to add to Ackland a few things. By the way, in Howard University, presidents, student presidents, usually have bourgeois people. First time yesterday, 2 days, 3 days ago, somebody came from the new president, had his meeting here in front of Sankofa. And the first act they have is they're calling a summit of International African Youth Summit on Pan-Africanism. What a coincidence. What a I was just flabbergasted. So I would say this, just to add something, and I'll tell you something. Africans in the diaspora, whether they like it or not, by historical location, have always been in the forefront of defining Pan-Africanism or coming up with Pan-Africanism, when even the African elites failed to do so. I was in Durban when AU was declared, and Mbeki was asked, where are the African diaspora people in this event? And he said it has nothing to do with them. This is like, so many people were so angry. The press just said, how can you have an African organization being invented, going from OAU to AU, and you don't have any diaspora representative? He just dismissed it. Like, I have the newspaper clipping. I'm going to take it to the Saturday meeting. But so we don't take too much time. We will go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to make a couple announcements. Again, thank you all for being here. And you all know that most of our events at Sankofa is typically, free of charge, and this is really a trial, and so I want to thank you all for participating in this trial effort. Your funds, of course, will go toward not compensating, because we cannot do that, but offering a gift to Baba Leo, and also to help keep these doors open in Sankofa. You got to realize how important it is that we keep the lights on and keep the air, on, and keep the doors open in this place. So your contributions will be going toward all of that, all of those efforts. So thank you again. Also, if you would please sign the sign-in sheet. Make sure you put in. We're in the honor system here, so whatever you put on that, that's what we're going to run with, and we appreciate that. And then if you have a cell phone, please turn your cell phone off or silent, so that you won't interrupt anything at all during the evening. So
Good,
thank you
good.
again.
Any question before he starts? Good. My brother, please. Let's welcome him, and thank you really.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to Sankofa for organizing this and inviting me to participate in it. And thanks most of all to those of you who have agreed to take time out to come to do this. There's so many things happening. So I know I'm talking to the choir, because the non-choir people are not here. If you have taken time out under the circumstances to join us, I know this is a special group. I just want to lay out the format. I don't like to lecture, I like to discuss. But as I do these things, I find that if we just go into a discussion, we waste a lot of time, because different people have different pieces of information. And so when I undertake to do serious work, I try to make sure that the members of the group, everybody, starts from the same database. So if we start from the same database, it means that some of what I say is going to be known to you already. That's all right. The point is we cannot assume that everybody is in possession of the same information. So forgive me if I start out by saying things that you may already know, but this is to create a common database so we can all move together as a team. This is not about individuals. This is about teamwork. So on each occasion, I'm going to try to spend the first hour giving you factual data, and then spend the second hour in discussion of the data. Right? I want to start out by saying that all of you have taken exams in school, universities, wherever you live. You cannot answer a question intelligently if you don't understand the question. Am I right? You cannot solve a problem if you do not understand the problem. No one can intelligently and effectively agree or disagree with an idea, a concept, or a proposal if you don't understand that idea, concept, or proposal. If you are entering into competition in a game, the probability of your defeating your team is very small if you don't understand your opponent. When I was a youngster and I captained my team, a cricket team, we had a team that on paper was only third best. There are two teams, person for person, better than my team. But we end up winning because whenever I was about to play a team, I went to watch that team at play. I didn't send anybody. I went and watched that team at play. So that when my team played them, I knew the strengths and weakness of every member of the opposing team. You understand that? Mm-hmm. All right. Because as Mount told us, and everybody else has told us long before, when you enter into battle, there are two things you must know. One, you must know yourself, and two, you must know your opponent. Never, never, ever underestimate your opponent, and never, ever overestimate your opponent. The only way you can avoid doing one of those two things is by knowing in detail the characteristics and strengths of your opponent. Okay? All right, now, I am going to try to do in each of these sessions, in 2 hours, what I normally do in 3 months. When I was teaching, each of these sessions that I'm doing would take 3 months. I'm going to condense data, which means I'm not going to be able to give you a lot of details, but I'm going to give you the general principles involved. Because if you know the general principles, you can figure the details out for yourself. Okay? I want to start out therefore discussing opposing worldviews. Because everything that is happening flows from a certain view of the world. And let me say, even before I go there, that every human being at some stage in life has to make decisions about three things. Because no human being can survive by themselves. Each of you at birth, if your mother gave birth to you in an isolated situation where there was no other human being around, and your mother died in childbirth, you would not survive. Right? So the fact that you have survived means that there were other human beings around at birth, whether it was your mother, your father, other relatives or friends, who helped to ensure your survival for the first few months at least of your life. So this idea of being a total individual where you don't need anybody is nonsense. Right? So that's what we mean when we say the human being is a social animal. No human being can survive. And so the worst punishment you can inflict on a human being is social isolation. Right? Social relationships mean that every human being at some point in life has to make serious decisions on three levels. What is your relationship to yourself? Meaning, how do you view yourself? Have you developed self-confidence, self-esteem? Are you in doubt about who you are? Are you very clear on whether you're a full and complete human being? Do you doubt your equality to all other human beings? These are decisions nobody can make for you. Each human being has to make that decision for him or herself. How do you relate to yourself? The second level you have is how do you relate to other human beings? And so nowadays, the first one we call individual psychology. And there are hundreds of textbooks on individual psychology. How you relate to others, we now call social psychology. How does the individual relate to the group? And before that, sociology is how do you understand the group as an observer? As an observer looking, do you understand the dynamics of the group? That's sociology. And then when you get involved in the group, how do you as an individual interact with it? That is social psychology. And the third level is how do you relate to the cosmos, to the entire universe? And that leads you into theology. Now, I'm not preaching any theology here, all right? But that is a reality. Every human being has to do that. Now, in order to arrive at some rational decisions at those three levels, which are isolated, we first have to have a total concept lot of concept. And since I'm going to give you my bias now, W.E.B. Du Bois said in 1905 that the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. Because being an optimist, he assumed the problem would be solved within 100 years. He thought it would be solved by the end of the 20th century. We are now into the 21st century. The problem has not been solved, and it is much more dangerous now than it was in 1905. It is more dangerous for two specific reasons. In 1905, the white members of planet Earth represented 40% of the population on planet Earth. Today, they're down to 20%. In 1905, they didn't have nuclear weapons. Today, they have nuclear weapons. The critical phase of this encounter began in 1968, when the United Nations undertook a study, a demographic study, and the study said at that time white people on planet Earth constituted 30% of the population of planet Earth. But given the birth rates and death rates, if things continued, by the year 2000, they would be down to 20%. And by the year 2050, they will be down to 15%. The census of 2000 confirmed that projection. In 2000, the world census demonstrated that the white population down to 20%. So when they keep telling you you are a minority, don't believe it. Non-whites are not a minority on planet Earth. Whites are a minority on planet Earth. And I'm talking about by their definition of what. Remember, let's say if you have 1/32nd part of non-white blood, you're not white, eh? Okay. And so that is their definition, and not my definition. That is their definition. But then more frightening was that in 2000, the Census Bureau of the United States put out a report saying that within the United States, by 2050, the white population within the United States would be down to 54% from 74%. Three months ago, the Census Bureau reviewed that figure and said, given world trends, whites in America will be down not to 54%, but to 48%. And then 5 weeks ago, they reviewed that again and said it is even worse. By 2050, they'll be down to 47%. These are not my figures. These are the official figures given by the U.S. Bureau of the Census. What does that mean? It means that that group is frightened. They're frightened. And any animal, including a mouse, including a mice, if cornered becomes vicious. So we're talking about human behavior here now. When any human being is cornered and their life is threatened as they perceive it, that person has the potential to become vicious. Now, when you become vicious and you have nuclear weapons, that is dangerous. You understand that?
Yes.
All right. So that is where we are. And so, I am saying that Du Bois' optimism did not work. And if he was alive, he would be the first to admit it, that things are worse now. And when I say worse, I don't mean that progress hasn't been made. Don't misunderstand me. I'm talking about the threat. It is like playing American football. You start at your own 10-yard line. And when you get to the 10-yard line of your opponent, that's where the warfare comes. If you believe that because you're on the 10-yard line of your opponent, you're going to score automatically, you're mad. Because when you get down to the 10-yard line, that is when everything is mobilized to block you from scoring a touchdown. All right. We, as a people, because of the Pan-African movement and other movements, when I came to this country, you could not gather more than 20% vote for any liberal human being in this country. I mean, the idea of running a black for major office for president was inconceivable. But you couldn't take a white liberal could not get more. The fellow who used to head the Socialist Party here, he never ran. He gave his ideas to the Democratic Party because he couldn't win. He was a socialist. Then we moved up from 20 to 25, and Martin and Malcolm and all them moved us from 20 to 25. And Jesse came and we moved to 30. And then after Jesse got 33% of the vote, Jesse announced publicly that race is no longer a critical factor in American life. You remember that? Do you remember that? Yes, yes. Jesse made that public announcement. That race was no, but don't get upset because Adam Powell had gone to the Bandung conference in 56 and said that racism had ended because after the Civil Rights Act was passed, racism had disappeared. Adam Powell made that statement at the founding of the Bandung conference. So Jesse was just kept continuing in that tradition. But they did move us forward. And then a young man has come along and he has moved us further. I don't want to get into that, but he has moved us further along. My problem is that as I talk to young people, they believe that nothing can stop us from scoring a touchdown. What if we don't score a touchdown? What will they do? Will they go into frustration and then into depression? Or will they understand that the struggle continues and that they need to be organized and mobilized to keep moving forward? Right? Now, that is a very serious thing because I don't need to tell you, you read the papers every day. You see what's happening. The game is becoming more obvious every day. So if anybody believes that victory is automatic, please go home and get in touch with reality. Nothing is going to be automatic, right? Now, I am really concerned very much about the younger people. How are they going to deal with the future? And do they understand the seriousness of the times in which they live? Because just marching up and down, shouting and making noise won't do it. There's nothing that your opponents would like more than for you to just get out there, start marching, shouting, engaging in violence so that they can shoot you down. They would have no compunction about doing that. Okay? Now, so we now have to be very sophisticated in understanding the game and how to play it. Right. So today, we're not looking at black people, because we'll talk about that when we come to the Pan-African thing. We want to look at the enemy, at the opponents, and to see what it is. But that behavior is not peculiar to them, because the same thing is found in all societies. What are the two prevailing worldviews that have been debated for thousands of years? Some people think it's just a recent thing. For thousands. The debate is slightly different now because racism has been redefined. In the old days, we had slavery, but slavery was never based on skin color. Slavery was based on being captured in warfare. And when you captured somebody in warfare, that person became your slave. But if that person converted to your culture and had something to offer, the history of Rome and Greece abounds in the name of individuals who were slaves, but who rose to the highest levels in their new countries, because it was not based on skin color. How many of you know that the patron saint of Germany is a black man? You can go over to Warrenton, Virginia, in that center that they have over there, which used to be reserved for whites. Blacks couldn't go here, but now you can go. And the centerpiece is a black man, and when you read it, he was a pope, and he is the patron saint of Germany. So it is not always true that black people were thought to be inferior. Right? No. But let us come to modern times, because we are living in the world now. There was a fellow called Thomas Hobbes. Right? And there was another fellow who was Thomas Hobbes, Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa. I'm using these people as examples of two different points of view. And these are extreme cases, and I'm not going into what falls in between. I'm talking about the two extremes. Because the debate for thousands of years has been between different people, different names at different times, but in the 1700s, the debate was between this man and this man. Thomas Hobbes and Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa. He's English, he's Italian. And Hobbes said that in the world, in its natural state, there was no such thing as good or bad, there was no such thing as right or wrong. There was no such thing as justice or injustice. He says each human being sought to maximize their freedom by denying freedom to everybody else. And he says, therefore, it was a matter of survival of the fittest. And in that environment, therefore, life was short, and I'm quoting, short, brutish, and nasty. That's what he says. In that word, life is short, brutish, and nasty. He says questions of equality do not arise. It is each for himself, and the devil takes the hindmost. Therefore, what you have is a war of one against all, and all against all. Right? This is jungle, the jungle philosophy. That philosophy continues until today. Right? That philosophy continues until today. I have simplified it. I've condensed it. He has a number of books, but that is what he condensed. Right? And he says, if you want to make it in this world, you have to start with that system, that belief. Because if you don't, people will take advantage of you. You must look out for yourself, eliminate everybody before they eliminate you, because it is survival of the fittest. There's no such thing as justice or injustice. There's no such thing as right or wrong. There's no such thing as good or bad. Right? It is just each for themselves. Warfare, one against all and all against all, and therefore life is short, brutish, and nasty. Okay? Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa said, that's not true. That each person has within them the potential to be good or evil. That each human being is a child of the divine being whatever you call him. And that each human being contains within themselves a spark of the divine, and with free will, you can choose whether to be good or evil. That's a totally different view of the world. Right? That is a totally different view of the world. That every human being is a child of the divine and has within him or her a spark of the divine which can propel you in either direction, because we each have these things in us. And using free will, you can determine which will predominate evil or good. Now, let me just say before I continue this, because we're going to hear a term talked about. When people like to make it appear that all problems have a single cause, if you just deal with that one thing, you solve the problem. I don't know of any problem that has a single cause. I don't know of it. Maybe you do. I don't know of it. So we talk about it is either, it is this or that. It is either A or B. Very often it is both A, B, C, and D. It's a combination of things. That is the concept that philosophers long before Marx was born described as the dialectic. That is to say, for everything on planet Earth, there is an opposite. If I say A, you can say not A. If I say B, you can say not B. Whatever A or B is. Everything has an opposite. How do you reconcile opposites? So if I say A, that is a thesis. You say not A, that's an antithesis. The A and B come together, and out of this conflict arises a new entity called a synthesis. So we have thesis, antithesis, and emerging out of that synthesis. That is what is called the dialectical process. That's all it is. I know when you go to universities, your philosophy professors won't tell you that, because they want to impress you with how much they know. So they try to make it sound very complex. Right? That is all the dialectic is. The dialectic is the coming together of opposites. Right? And the resolution of the opposites gives rise to a third situation different from both original. And that's the synthesis. And that, for example, that is how science advances. So that the synthesis then becomes the thesis at the higher level. At the next level, the synthesis now becomes the thesis. There develops an antithesis to that thesis. You get a new synthesis, and that's what Plato calls, right, the hypothesis of the hypothesis, or the higher hypothesis. That is all it means, you know. I don't know why it is in universities. I sometimes just sit in class listening to professors, and rather than trying to teach and get people to understand, they spend their time trying to impress people with how much they know. The damn thing is not that difficult. You see, it can be explained in simple terms. But they prefer not to do that, because if they tell you that, you won't know how bright they are. That is what the dialectic is. Right? And the common example is the Chinese concept of yin and yang, male and female. If opposites always result in conflict, men and women will be fighting unto death, like some of them trying to do now. Right? But in the real world, and certainly in the African and Asian world, men and women were not viewed as being in conflict. Men and women were viewed as being complementary. That is to say, it took the union of a male and a female to produce a new life. That's the synthesis. The male, the female, the opposites coming together, producing a new entity. That's the synthesis. Not conflict, it's complementarity. It's a totally different concept, right? No. I say that because as we go through that every day in life, you're going to find that. Because somebody doesn't agree with you, does that mean they don't like you? Does that mean you have to fight them? I go to organizations over and over, and I hear people wanting to kill each other. Over what? We decide, for example, we're going to have a conference in Chicago. You say, I don't like to drive. If I drive for long distances, I get sick. Somebody else says, if I take the plane, I get sick. And you begin to say, well, I don't give a damn. We will take a plane. What does it matter how you get to Chicago? If we have agreed, the objective is to get to Chicago to do some serious work, you get to Chicago by any means you, if you want to walk, that's your business. If you want to ride a bicycle or a motorbike, that is your business. The objective is the thing. The objective is to get to Chicago on a particular date to do some serious work. We don't need to kill each other over tactics, meaning how do we get to Chicago? And yes, still when I go to groups and organizations and they're involved in fight and trying to kill each other, and when I check it out, they are not discussing objectives. They are fighting over some petty tactic. But you're encouraged to do that. And you fall for it. Right? Now, I have to watch my time. Now, these two worldviews that I have given you, I'm going to summarize the differences. So it's Thomas Hobbes versus Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa. Okay? What are the practical consequences? Let me stand back. What are the practical consequences of these two particular points of view? I have summarized it here, and I'm going to write them out for you so that you can write it down. This leads to survival of the fittest. Okay? Versus being in the image of the divine. Okay? Number two is competition. Versus cooperation. Okay? Competition versus cooperation. Next, force versus reason, ethics, and morality. Okay? Then comes dependence versus independence. Can you see this?
Yes.
Can you see it? All right. Then comes social stratification. social mobility. Let me get it out of the way. I'm running down for you. These are the logical outcomes of thinking and behaving if you adopt this view of the world. You will believe in survival of the fittest. You will emphasize competition over cooperation. You will prefer the use of force over reason, ethics, and morality. Dependence, you will try to make other people dependent on you rather than encouraging independence, right? You will believe in social stratification. You know, all Western societies are based on social stratification, versus social mobility or egalitarianism. As a matter of fact, if you run for office in this country and they call you an egalitarian, but then you believe in egalitarianism, you have difficulty getting elected. Right. Authoritarianism versus democracy. And don't be confused because people call themselves Democrats. People are free to call themselves anything they want. You don't judge people by what they say, you judge them by what they do. Most people who tell you they're Democrats, their behaviors do not indicate that they are Democrats. Right? Then we have the concentration of wealth in the hands of the few. So that's how you control people, by controlling the means of livelihood. So if you believe in that, you believe in concentrating wealth in the hands of the few, whereas here you would believe in diffusing the means of livelihood. Here you believe in the restriction of opportunities. Over here you believe in equality, promoting equality of opportunity. Right? Here, this is conformity versus creativity. Conformity versus creativity. This is mind control versus self-control. That's what I want to talk about a little bit. Mind control versus self-control. And the summation of all that is the policy, therefore, on this time you will end up with a policy of looting as opposed to a policy of promoting the general welfare. Now, for 500 years, the Western world has engaged in a policy of looting. Though at election time, they tell you they are about promoting the general welfare. Right? But nowhere in the last 500 years on planet Earth has the Western world sought to promote the general welfare. And when it does promote it, it is like the Constitution. We, the people, but they forget to put in bracket white people.
You're right. Yeah.
right? Now, the Constitution is one of the most beautiful documents you can read. And if you're white, it applies to you. But since they put it in writing, we can say, well, we are humans too. But remember, they cover themselves by saying, in the Constitution, that you're only 3/5 of a person. So none of it applies to you, or to the non-white world. Now, that is the reality. And I don't care. No, you see, I know when I say this to groups that want to fight me. But I don't care. Because I differentiate between black American and American black. Which are you? Are you black and then American? Or are you American and then black? Because if you're American and then black, you're going to take this. Because don't believe that only white people think like that. A lot of black people in America and across the world, don't get confused now, in the Caribbean and in Africa, we have large percentages of those who have accepted this. And so when we got independence and they took over from whites, nothing changed. All that changed was the people occupying the positions of leadership. And all they said was, my time has come now. My time now. And I'm going to do precisely what the white man used to do. And that is because they know nothing else. Because learning, listen to this now, this does not have to do with black or white, this is human. Learning in all human beings occur in 3 stages. The first stage is imitation. The second stage is trial and error. And only later do we come to conceptual thinking. So a people who have been exposed for life to a particular environment and a particular set of social organizations who know no other, if you put them in power, will do that to which they are accustomed. And that accounts for the behavior in Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America since independence. The people who came, not all, but a large percentage of the people who came to power. And even right here in America, when I talk to groups, and they tell me, oh, I'm opposed to the system, I say, you're lying. 85% of people who tell me they're opposed to the system are not opposed to the system. They are merely opposed to their place within the system.
That's right.
If they got a break tomorrow, they'll behave just like everybody else. You understand that?
Yes.
No. So if we are going to be serious, we have to understand that. Don't fool ourselves. That is reality. Now, therefore, now, since none of us are perfect, and none of us is totally evil, and none of us are perfectly good, the question each human being in this room and everywhere else has to stand in front of a mirror and talk to that person in the mirror and say, what kind of a human being do I want to be? And very often we end up with some combination. Or we do different things at different times under different circumstances. Right? But when you do, you must know what you're doing. You can't do it because it is right, or it is expedient. You must be very clear why you're doing it. But these are the choices you have to make. Right? Now, the white world understands that. And so, they don't sit passively by and leave you free to make these decisions. Right? If they just left you free to make the decision, a number of you would choose to behave more like this. Right? But no. They exercise power, meaning military power, that is to say they threaten you with the use of force. They exercise economic power, that is to say they threaten to give or withhold the means of livelihood. So if you work on a job and you want to try to unionize, the boss will call you in and tell you, and you are one of my best workers. I'm very impressed with you, and I would love to keep you. But we are going to be downsizing in 3 months' time. And if you continue your current activities, I may not be able to keep you. Right? Now you have to go home and think about that. And if you don't give a quick answer, he tells you, well, the best I can do for you, I have a job that pays less than the one you have now, but I can give you that one. And then you might say, well, you know, I'm not going to sacrifice my principles, so I take the lower paying job. And then 3 months later, you come out and say, we're going to downsize again. What are you going to do this time? And by the third time, when he tells you, if you don't stop, you don't have a job, then you have to decide whether you're going to keep on organizing or not. Right? Is that the reality of life? That doesn't happen to anybody in here, does it? Everybody. Oh, okay. All right. Well, I just want to be, I know that I thought this might be an exceptional group. I thought it might be an exceptional group. Because I know it happened to everybody who I know. Right? And then they put all this together in a thing called divide and rule. And that strategy has now changed for 500 years. The strategy of divide and rule. And in 1954, the British Foreign Office published a document. It was entitled, I don't know how they published it, they must have forgotten. And they said, headed, How to Defeat the Anti-Colonial Struggle. How to defeat the anti-colonial struggle. And this is what the document says. We will engage the strategy of divide and rule. And the principles are as follows. 1, flattery. Flattery. In other words, take this group. Suppose this group becomes very active and is doing serious work. And they now perceive this group as a threat. How do you destroy the group? How do you render the group ineffective? You employ the strategy of divide and rule. And the first thing you do, you come in and you pick somebody who you've been checking them out. You've done a psychological, suppose people don't know we do psychological profile on every potential leader. We know, the CIA has 4 files on every potential leader. Right? A medical file, a social file, an economic and political file, and a psychological file. Every potential leader, they have a file. Those 4 files on there. And the psychological one is very important. We know what motivates you, we know what you like, we know what you like to drink, we know what we like to music you like to listen to. They have all that in the file. Now, as you know, in many organizations, we have information officers. And you will send the information officer on the radio to make a speech. And after our information officer makes that speech 3 times, when he's walking, he or she is walking down the road, he says, "Hey Jim, I heard you, man, you sounded great. Man, Jim, you're doing great." Jim begins to feel good. Huh? Particularly if the ladies start to tell him how good he's doing. You understand? All right. So somebody comes to Jim and says, "But Jim, I've heard you 3 times on the radio, and man, you're bright. But you're brighter than the leader. Or you should be the leader." And at which point, you say, "God damn, this man is bright." Because I knew long ago that I was bright, but nobody else knew it. He's the first man I have met who recognizes how bright I am. You see? And that ain't difficult, because the majority of human beings have not learned to control their egos. You understand that?
Yes.
The majority of human beings on planet Earth have not learned to control their egos. So it is not difficult to win them over by flattery. The second thing, if flattery doesn't work, then you move to bribery. You offer them some benefits, maybe in the form of money, in the form of scholarship, in the form of a job for a relative, whatever. No, these things, there's no special order in which you do it. The reason why you start with flattery, they don't cost you anything. It costs you nothing to flatter someone. Right? Now, if they don't fall for it, then you move to bribery. That's when it costs you something. So you have to give up something. If flattery plus bribery doesn't do it, you use the threat of force. And at that point, a whole lot of people start backing away. And if the threat of force doesn't do it, you apply force. You use force. Now, nobody in this room was alive, apart from us, 3 of us, maybe, in the 60s. But that's how they destroyed the black movement in the 60s. That's precisely what they did. Finally, if flattery combined with bribery, combined with the threat of force, combined with the use of force doesn't work, you infiltrate the organization and take it over and change its direction. And so in these organizations who have limited resources, the infiltrator usually is the one who can provide you with some money. Because every time the organ is about to die, he says, "Man, I know a little man who prepared to give us some money." And after a while, when he has done that a number of times, everybody said, "Well, this is a good man." And he gets elected president of the organization, and then he brings in his other cohorts, and he destroys the organization. Now, this, for 500 years, they've been doing this. And the only thing that changes from time to time is the intensity of it and the combinations that they use. But divide and rule involve those 5 things: flattery, bribery, the threat of force, the use of force, an infiltration and takeover of the organization. Now, do a study of the black movement in the 60s and 70s, and you can document that. So, I'm saying to you in reality, when you start out, some people think you must start with a large number of people. It is always better when you're about to do serious work to start with a small group that is committed and think alike than a large, diverse group. It may be for political reasons you need a large group, but never let that large group be part of the inner circle in the beginning. Because that large group is bound to contain a number of agents whose purpose is to destroy the group. Even when the group is small, you're likely to have some, any damn amount. Now that is where, you see, I have a problem when I used to be at Howard. I had a serious problem with every president, except Mordecai Jones. Because they don't want us to teach these things even to graduate students. It's not in the textbook. They just want you to read what's in the textbook. The textbook is the theory. When you go out into the real world, you ain't nothing like that happening. That is why wisdom is the combination of knowledge and experience. You cannot gain wisdom until you have had experience. Because however good you may theorize, until you put it to the test, you don't know whether or not it will work. That is what is called the scientific method. You can come up with the most fabulous sounding hypothesis. It means nothing to a scientist until you set up an experiment to test the hypothesis. Because when you test the hypothesis, it may not work. And if it doesn't work, it knows, however brilliant you thought and logical you thought it was, something is wrong because it didn't work. You have to back up and say, what is wrong? How do I change this? So only a fool will make a decision and say, I will never change. When you make a decision, it is a temporary decision subject to review as further information comes in. And you must always be collecting additional information to see if your first decision was correct. And you must have a mechanism for modifying your decision as you collect additional data. But I see some world leaders saying that I have spoken and therefore it is so. And they're paying the price for it. So that is where we are. Now, I want to talk a little bit about these. I think you understand. I want to talk about mind control and self. We are in the phase now. Listen, political domination has been, they know how to do that. Economic domination, they know how to do that. And people all over the world recognize political domination. They recognize economic domination, and they have some idea of how to fight against it. It is, any paper you read will tell you, the scientific discoveries between 1945 and now, between 1945 and now, we have had more scientific discoveries than we had in the previous 300 years. That's a fact. What they're not telling you, the same applies in the field of psychology. And between 1945 and now, and certainly in the last 25 years, in psychology, there's been a field called behavior modification. And behavior modification is another word for figuring out how to get people to alter their beliefs, values, and therefore behavior. There are hundreds of thousands of experiments. But I'm going to tell you something, and people are not, the public is not supposed to know it, but it's all right. If you summarize all of that, what it really boils down to is that every human being on planet Earth wishes to be successful. There is not a single human being on planet Earth who does not wish to be successful. The problem is that every human being has a different definition of success. The wino on the corner wants to be successful. But his definition of success is that if he gets a bottle of wine by 11 o'clock, he got a successful day.
It's fine.
Life is beautiful. Huh? Success really has two major definitions. One is the acquisition of money, material things, and status. You know? The acquisition of money, material things, and status. That's one. The other is service to humanity. Now, if you decide to pay no attention to money, material things, and status, and only serve humanity, you may not be able to eat. You may have a problem paying your bills. But if you decide to hell with service to humanity, I just want money, material things, and status, then you have decided to be a prostitute. Whether a physical prostitute or an intellectual prostitute. And for my part, I have greater respect for the physical prostitute than the intellectual prostitute. Because the physical prostitute very often resorts to prostitution out of necessity to survive. The intellectual prostitute is capable of making a living and without prostitution, but because he wants to be as good as or better than the Joneses, to buy the biggest car and to live in the biggest house, you serve the interest of the master and destroy your own people in the interest of those who oppress your people. And you justify any damn thing that people want you to justify. And that is what is happening in the third world. We have a bunch of academics and intellectuals. Please remember, Hitler was surrounded by brilliant academics. Stalin was surrounded by brilliant academics. Roosevelt was surrounded by brilliant academics. Churchill was surrounded by brilliant academics. There is no shortage of brilliant academics. So for someone to tell me that I'm a brilliant academic tells me nothing. The question is, whose interest will you serve? That is the test. Whose interest will you serve? The mafia contains some of the brightest minds in the world. Do you want to go that route? Being academically bright tells me nothing. Whose interest are you prepared to serve? No, those are the kinds of decisions that we have to make. And so this is the start of it all. And based on this, you have to make those kinds of decisions. Not easy. The other thing, I don't know if any of you know, do any of you know any country that fought for independence and got it in less than 15 years?
15.
Hmm? But I see people joining movements and after 6 months, say, boy, this movement ain't going anywhere. I can't deal with this. It's taking too long. You understand? After 6 months, you're ready to quit. The oppressor who has been working for 500 years has amassed money. Let me give you the latest data. Applying this system, the world, the University of the United Nations did a study and published the results on December the 5th, 2006. I'm sorry. December the 5th, 2006 is right. And this is what the study says. This is the university. And the 3 people who did the study were all Nobel Prize economists, so you can't question that. Let me tell you what the study shows. The upper 40, and the study is entitled World Distribution of Household Wealth. Right? World Distribution of Household Wealth. The upper 40% of people in the world control 94% of the wealth of the world. Listen carefully. The upper 40% of the people on planet Earth control 94% of the wealth of the world. The upper 1% controls 40% of that 94. Right? That means that the lower 60% control how much? 6%. The lower 60% of the people on planet Earth get 6%. But the lower 50% get 1.1%. Now that data is known. It's public information. But yet still, the World Bank, the IMF, and the leaders of the world keep telling you the system is working. And they mean it, so it is working. No, you keep saying the system is not working because you don't have the same objective as they have. But as far as they are concerned, the system is working because the stated objective is global dominance. And global dominance is to be achieved by concentrating wealth in the hands of the few and to reduce the power of government because only government can protect the interests of the weak and the poor. So the data goes on to show that of the 100 wealthiest entities on planet Earth, 51 are corporations, 49 are countries. You know? Of the 100 wealthiest entities on planet Earth, 51 are corporations, 49 are countries. That is what has happened. The greatest transfer of wealth from the poor to the wealthy has occurred in the last 15 years. Now, common sense would tell you, normally, you should be transferring wealth from what? From the wealthy to the poor. But we have been transferring wealth from the poor to the wealthy.
Did you say the last 15 years or 50 years? Did you say the transference occurred in the last 15 years or 50 years?
No, that accentuated tremendously in the last 15 years. Yes. So that is where we are. Those are some of the practical consequences of these views, what the world views. Right? Each of you, each human being has to make individual decisions as to where they stand. What combination of this is acceptable to you? And what are you going to do about it? At the personal level, at the local level, at the state level, at the national level, and at the international level. And the other thing to understand is where there's a feeling of isolation, there's also a feeling of hopelessness. But the data that I've just given you has spurred people into action. Because we predicted years ago that there was going to be a food crisis. The policies that have been pursued over the last 30 years have guaranteed that there would be a food crisis, but nobody chose to do anything about it. But now that it has hit, because unfortunately a number of us don't react until something hits us personally. But I'm going to give you one more thing and then I stop. There's an experiment that we do in psychology where you put 25 rats in a cage and you feed them at will, meaning you have 25 rats, you put enough food for 30 rats. So that every rat can eat and overeat, right? No problem. And the rats play and they frolic and they have fun. Right? And you give them a lot of space. Then you begin to constrict the space. But you still give them enough food. And as you constrict the space, they get irritable. And you give them just enough food, maybe for 20 rats. There are 25 rats. You know, food for 20. And you restrict the space. They get very irritable. But you restrict the space some more and they get more irritable. But then you begin to take away the food. And you get down to the point where you give the 25 rats, you put food for only 15. And the rats begin to cannibalize each other. The rats will cannibalize each other. Now somebody who wasn't there at the beginning of the experiment, right? Coming along and seeing rats cannibalizing each other will say it is the nature of rats to cannibalize each other. Right? You then drop it and you give them food for only 10, and they really get vicious. And then you start increasing the amount of food, not the space, the food. And they start calming down. The moral of the story and the social lesson of the story, that restriction of space leads to irritability but not to cannibalization. But the absence of food leads to cannibalization. Now think about the ghettos of the world and how that can be applied. And try and explain to yourself and to others why you have certain behaviors in the ghettos. It's not enough. We know that. These things we know. We know what to do. Right? So the mistake they made was not to act to prevent a food crisis. Because they got so greedy, gobbling up money and material things. They decided that these people are just going to crawl off in a corner and die peacefully. But that era is over. Nobody's going to crawl off in a corner and die peacefully anymore. People are going to react. And so the food crisis has caused spontaneous eruptions all over the world. You can't do that anymore. Understand? Such is the world in which we currently live. Such are the problems that we are facing. And so, such is the sophistication of the oppression. And we have to be able to evolve ways of dealing with that at an equally sophisticated level. I want to thank you, and I will
we put gaps between the, we left Tuesday for time of thinking, processing what is lectured for Wednesday. So you guys will come with more research or question. But immediately now, while it's on the hot plate, any question you have now is appropriate.
The next session is on Wednesday.
Wednesday at 7, the same time here. But we leave gap. We were going to do it in just Monday and Tuesday, but we felt gap is important just to process the idea. And so, any question on the topic today? Clarifications.
Any question or comment on this discussion?
You said that the Hobbesian view argues clearly that life is nasty, cruel, brutish, and short. And coming out of the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, the demographics of the European experience would certainly undermine European expansion if life is going to be short. That is, Europeans would be entering into the 21st century recognizing as they go along that they would have a smaller and smaller and smaller population while still embarking on an imperial thrust. Having come into the 21st century, did their philosophers and demographers come to grips with that reality that the philosophy of life being short, nasty, cruel, brutish, and short, which is a violent idea, which is an autocratic idea, would have an enormous impact on population expansion and therefore the ability to provide the military capability for their dominance in the world as you expressed?
Actually, I want to raise that in detail when we discuss Pan-Africanism, because the fact is, when we get to that, I will share with you official documents in which, as I said, after 1968, when this was made available, the governments of the Western world undertook policies to promote population reduction. not among white people. No, it happens that it didn't work because most of these policies don't work. They don't work. But for example, the policies were intended. You are the ones who are supposed to have lives that are short, nasty, and brutish, not them. Right? But it happens that they can't differentiate. It is like when Reagan was president, and he asked for data on welfare, who are the recipients of welfare. And he was given the data that percentage-wise, blacks had much more people on welfare than whites had.
Per capita.
Eh?
Per capita.
No, he was just given the percentage. And this percentage of blacks and this percentage of whites. And the percentage of blacks was much higher than the percentage of whites. But it was the percentage of a smaller number. Right? What he didn't know was that there were more whites as individuals on welfare than blacks. And so when he moved to abolish welfare, it was thought that it would affect only black people. It turned out that the large number of people were white, and they had to stop it. That was modified. Right? So at no time, remember I said, this is a dynamic process. None of these sides can afford to sleep. There's a constant tug of war. Constant. And any side that goes to sleep loses. That's the reality.
Survival of the fittest.
Yeah. Any side that goes to sleep loses. So that is why whenever we start to win, they do things to lull us into sleep. And we, over and over, we get lulled into sleeping. And while we go to sleep, they pull us over the thing. But there are reactions, and we will come to that
Okay.
in greater detail.
Here.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Boldy.
I just wanted to, internalizing this vast wealth of information. How do we begin to empower ourselves to counteract this or be proactive on this side? What is the beginning stages of us to begin to empower ourselves to take action? And I know you spoke about disseminating the immense amount of information by assigning people different subjects, so that this is the authority on this subject and what have you. So bring
First thing you have to do is to internalize the data. Let me tell you what we're doing. We're doing 4 lectures in which you're going to receive a lot of data. This is only one. That is why we leave a day in between. Because after you go home, you can't just walk out of here and don't think about it until you come back. You have to go, think about it, absorb the data, make some personal decisions about the data. Because next time, I'm not going through this again. I'm going to be giving you additional data on additional things. But that is the way the world is, very complex.
Let me interfere too a little bit. So we can minimize, like time is running. It's about today's question, not the summary. Where we're heading is it's like a wave building towards the tornado in terms of towards what the solution.
We're going to get to that.
Yeah, we're going to get to that. But it's very important that the questions deal about today's topics.
But I'm saying, if there's anything
about today
that you
Yeah.
don't understand.
I would like, anybody there? Go, young lady there.
I just want to know how they have been able to strategize for mixed races.
Hmm?
For mixed race.
For mixed races?
Yeah, like
No,
how
but
did they
this data
strategize?
applies to all races. I'm talking about human behavior. I am saying anybody, you see, it happens that our interest may be for a particular group. But don't assume that the white race is homogeneous. Just as though the black race is not homogeneous. We have people in the black group who think like this. We have people who think like this. Among whites, we have people who think like this and people who think like this. among Asians, we have people who think like this and who think like that. In all groups, these behaviors are found within groups and between groups. As you move, you have to decide what your objectives are, because you can't solve all the problems, and you may want to concentrate on a particular piece. You see what I'm saying? But what I am telling you is about human behavior. Now, one of the consequences is that if you want to make allies, you need to be careful in selecting your allies. And you want to select people who veer more towards this than towards that. But again, the group has to decide what its objectives are. That will come when we talk about planning.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let me bring you then to the Hobsonian theory. At the time it's happening, or consolidating in Europe, specifically in England, I'm like, as you were talking, I was flashing into South Africa, the United States. This whole Hobsonian paradigm has this amazing connection to imperialism.
That's what it is.
Yeah, I know, but now take me back. Wasn't there also a contradiction of Hobson himself, and the Genesis contradiction with the aristocracy or the royal family of England, or what would you call the nobility? Did he have a contradiction? Did it have an appearance of progressive?
That's the other side. That's the other side.
No, but this is, you see, life is progressive. When it started out, remember, first it was the king.
Yeah.
Then afterwards, the king had to share power with the pope, with the head of the church. Huh? And then the king, let's go back a little bit quickly to Plato and Aristotle, where they say you have to organize things like a pyramid. At the top, small 10% at the top, are the philosopher kings. And they're the ones who have knowledge, nobody else has. And they rule. In the middle are the bureaucrats and the soldiers. The bureaucrats serve the interest of the 10%. The soldiers protect the interest of the 10%, right? And the lower 60% are the workers, who do what they are told to do. And you don't educate them, you train them. So if you need carpenters, you train carpenters. If you need plumbers, you don't educate them, because to educate them is dangerous, because they may begin to think for themselves. That is why in Europe, up until the 1930s, children of non-elites could not go to Oxford or Cambridge. Only children of the elite. And in the colonies, Africa and the Caribbean, only the top scholars were given a scholarship to go to Oxford and Cambridge. And when they get back, they were Englishmen, not Africans or Caribbean. Right? So, I mean, we understand how to set the thing up. Now, the nobles, after a while, after they got some money, said, damn, I want to live a little bit like the king. And so we got the Magna Carta in England. The Magna Carta was not written for poor people. The Magna Carta was the revolt of the nobles against their king, saying, we serve your interest, but we are part of the elite, but you need to share some of it with us. So the Magna Carta, like the U.S. Declaration of Independence and Constitution, was not written for everybody. It happened that we have taken advantage of it and said, since you announced it as a general principle, then it should apply to everybody. Right?
Yeah, but my problem is, I know that one is very clear. That aspect of it is clear. But my problem is Hobson himself was run out of London and had been exiled to France.
Yeah,
what was that contradiction? If he was serving the ideological framework of imperialism, Why was there a contradiction between the ideologue and the ruling class?
Because there are conflicts within the ruling class. There are cliques within the ruling class who fight against each other. And when a particular clique comes in, it throws out the intellectual supporters of the other clique. Remember that the colonization by England took place through the East India Company. It wasn't the government who went and did it. They created a company called the East India Company. The Dutch created a company called the Dutch East India Company. And they acted just as people are doing now, telling you that the private sector must be the engine of growth and control. It's the same thing. Right?
I think on some level Blackwater, but Blackwater.
Yeah, Blackwater.
Currently can be analogized in that same respect in Iraq, that these private mercenary companies are doing the job,
In Iraq.
for lack of a better term, of the government.
But Leo, I think also too, you see, there are forces emerging in England at the time, in the post-Hobbes period, and antagonisms by the church that are anti not only royalty and the governments that had become corrupt, the kingships, but there's also the War of Cromwell, one. There's also on the European side the emergence of a whole new body of knowledge going from Descartes to Rousseau, etc., that's going to lead to the French Revolution by the 19th century. So that there are a number of forces that are breaking down this idea. And you're entering into what they like to call the age of enlightenment, where there are new ideas being posed by Locke and Hume and David Hume and these people that are very important. Utilitarianism comes into so Hobbes, yes, as a supporter of the royalty, as a supporter of the imperial order, as a supporter, and as you see, if you look at his ideas, those ideas are very current today. They are the ideas of imperial order, whether you look at it here now, or you look at it in 1905, or you look at it in 1845. In the 60s, we would argue that this was socialism versus capitalism. And what I think Leo has done is not taken out the ideology from it, from this argument, and say, look, it is a body of thought. It's a certain way of looking at the world. And if you don't get tripped up into the ideology that would then label you as a Marxist, or label you as an imperialist or capitalist, then you can look at it with some distance and so on.
See, you have to remember quickly that the world has moved quite a bit. Remember, the monarch was once absolute.
Yes.
Absolute. Then the nobles said, we want a piece of the action. In time, with the Industrial Revolution, the middle class said, we want a piece of the action. So things kept changing. But every time they said, we want a piece of the action, they didn't change the system. They just changed their position within the system. They got included in the system. But the system stayed. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. But the system is taking in more and more people, which is what they're trying to do now. On a global level. If you take in, and usually what they try and do, like in an organization, they try and take in the top leadership of the organization. And you cut the head off, and the body dies. Yeah. Yes, sir.
The cardinal characteristics, I assume, are the characteristics of an ideal society?
Yeah.
Well, if I think in terms of traditional African societies, there is a combination of Hobbesian as well as cardinal. So has there ever been any ideal society except for early man?
It is a matter of balance. It is always a matter of balance. If, for example, even in a corporation, when Johnson was president, there was a hell of a fight between Johnson and de Gaulle. And de Gaulle told Johnson that he's uncivilized, that he's a cowboy. Because Johnson said, we don't have time for niceties. Control them. De Gaulle said, no, you don't do that. If we are a minority, so what we must do, we must think of this thing as a corporation. We must give the other folks 40% of the seats. And we keep 60. And treat them very nice. If you treat them very nice, the chances are 10 to 1 that they won't be united. The 40% won't be united. So if the 60% stays united, right, and 10% of the 40 join with the 60, we win 70 to 30 every time. But even if they should come together, they are 40%. We still win 60 to 40. But they get the feeling of involvement. So when I used to teach community development, I used to point out that there's no textbook written that says you must involve people. None. The textbook says you must give people the feeling of involvement. That's what the textbook says. It doesn't say you must involve them. It says you must give them the feeling of involvement. You understand that? All right.
There's a brother there. 1 second. Go ahead.
Yeah, the questions I have are two. One, the Cardinal Nichols of Kuzma and the relationship between Italy and England at the time. Was this related to how England was trying to maintain a non-Catholic rule within their government system? So that if Cardinal, I'm assuming, is Roman Catholic.
No. In fairness, it was not that at all. Because there were people in England, in Italy, who taught just like that. Okay. There were people in England who taught like this. But Cardinal Nicholas was the most effective speaker and proponent of the cause. That's why I pick him. Not because he's an Italian, not because he's a religious man. I'm just picking him as an exponent of a body of thought. You see what I'm saying? And all I'm counterposing are two different bodies of thought. Okay. This body of thought existed everywhere. This body of thought existed everywhere. It was a matter of, in different countries, different people became dominant at different times. Right? So it is always a question.
One more question.
It is always a question.
You said two.
Yeah. So the second question is a follow-up to the first one. If in discussing the inevitable death of Europeans through time, does it matter then whether or not Europeans exist if these two
External.
Yeah, always. I mean, those people who are unarmed are vulnerable to those who are armed. Right? If you are unarmed, if you walk out on the street now, right now, and somebody comes up to you and put a gun to your head, you are vulnerable. Right? So I'm saying we talk in reality now. We're not talking about being a fool. You know, for example, if you live in a neighborhood where people are breaking into the house, you can't say, well, I don't believe in violence and therefore I'm going to leave my door open. Because, you know, no. We talk in reality. So that is why I keep saying to you, this is like a tug of war. One is pulling this way, one is pulling that way, and at different times, the thing goes to and fro. But this belief that is going to be solved once and for all is not going to work. The fight is continuous. And anytime you stop pulling, the other side will win. So that is part of our problem. Every time we make 2 steps forward, we go home and celebrate. You understand? We run home and celebrate. If we make 2 steps forward, we leave the field of battle completely and go home and celebrate.
Well, let me follow with this one. In terms of South Africa, for example, or even Native American and the Americas in general, the local society, by and large, while armed physically, took European motives as visitors. And so which part of their ideology was shortchanged?
No,
Hobsonian or the cardinal?
Yeah.
Because, like, for example, while the Xhosas were fighting, the Khoi assimilated
That's right.
and became even soldiers.
Yeah,
Not because they didn't have arms before.
No, but because of the divide and rule game. If you perfect the divide and rule game, you can always pick off a certain amount. And so what you do, if we wanted to play a war game, we could game it out, right? And every move you make, I make another move. The enemy is not standing quiet. Right? When I come in with a plan to dominate you. You say I'm not going to be dominated. Right? Mm-hmm. I say yes, you're going to be dominated. No, don't think of it as warfare. Think of it just as a game. Let us leave the killing out for the time being. Every time you make a move, like a chess, I'm going to make a move. If I can read the game better than you, I'm going to win.
That's the dialectics of the point. But were there, for example, if the Xhosas felt, if they had within their own thought system divide and rule, they applied it. Some nationalities in South Africa did apply it, but there was nationalities who felt divide and rule itself is beneath their moral standing, and here we don't seem to see Hobson being a predominant thought system.
Yeah, I hear you. I think you have to deal with reality. I keep saying you have to deal with reality. I mean, you don't want to jump down in the sewer to rescue a man in the sewer. You give him a hand. You lift him out. But if somebody has a gun and you don't have a gun, you have to figure out a way to get the gun away from the man. It doesn't mean that when you get it, you won't shoot him. You understand what I'm saying? If somebody tries to hold you up and on the street, if you don't want to die, you have to find some way of talking yourself out of being killed. And even if the man hands you the gun, you have two choices at that point. You can say, sucker, you are trying to kill me, boom, and shoot it. Or you can say, I took the gun, no, I'm not going to shoot you because you are my brother. And I want you to learn a lesson because I have the gun now. I could shoot you if I wanted, but I'm not going to shoot you because you're a human being. I want you to go and think about that in the hope that he'll think about it and change. But you don't, if he has a gun, you don't tell him, sucker, do what you want, because he will shoot you. You understand what I'm saying? So that is why, what I'm saying, this game is extraordinarily sophisticated. That's why I used the analogy before, that an animal when frightened is dangerous. Because to the point that people now believe, and these are people who honestly to God believe, that they are ordained by the divine to rule planet Earth. They believe it. It's not a matter, they're not pretending, they believe it. But if they come to the conclusion that they are losing control of planet Earth, they become extraordinarily dangerous. And they are dangerous armed with nuclear weapons. The question then is, how do you deal with that? And I will therefore give you a riddle, and let us talk about it for 5 minutes the next time. If you go to New York City this weekend, and you're passing the Empire State Building, right? And out of nowhere, a madman runs up to you and puts a gun to your head. And he says, let's walk. And he takes you up on top of the Empire State Building. He's mad, eh? And he says, jump or I shoot. How would you deal with that problem? Tell me about that next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. What happened? Leo, I'm struggling with this thing here. Look, Aristotle and Plato talked about the movement from darkness into light, the man in the cave. And they built their epistemology on the resolution of that movement from darkness to light in order to deal with sophistication. Hobbes and Locke and others talk about man in the state of nature, but they are writing at the time of the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and using the language of the Renaissance to talk about man in the state of nature. If you see what I'm saying now, the questions that then come out of that dialogue that you've got to do are not questions that deal with life in the state of nature, but rather life that already exists, that's provable, that's nasty, cruel, brutish, and short, or life that could be democratic, or life that could be the other things that you have there in terms of social mobility, etc., because it's a different structure. The same thing Descartes had to deal with. Now, when we come to look at this, at the language today, and we say, well, okay, here we are. We have two things. One, these people here on the cardinal side, this is a liberal argument, because when we look at all of that, we see social mobility, we see collectivity, we see reason, ethics, and so on. We see self-control, we see these things, and we say, well, these are liberal ideas. And when we go over here, we say, well, these are conservative ideas, these are authoritarian principles in which we have the world that we live in. Aren't we prisoners of our present language and experience in trying to deal with what Hobbes and Locke and others and the Cardinal and others deal with, in the same way that CLR and others, when they talked about every cook can govern in the debates of Aristotle and Plato, found themselves choosing a language that would allow them to justify their dialectical process.
No, but I'm not trying to justify any particular dialectical process. I am saying if you go back 1,000 years, the language may be different. The principles will be the same. As a result of the epistemology of Aristotle, he came up with a political philosophy and a social philosophy different from Plato, but different only in degree. Both Aristotle and Plato at that time thought that life had to be stratified. Society had to be stratified, right? Stratification, the concept of non-stratification comes later. At the time of Aristotle and Plato, there was no concept of non-stratification. But we are dealing now with a problem as it now exists. Therefore, we have to use the language of the present for people to understand, because you have to speak to people in a language that they understand. No, it is no longer a question between the king and the nobles. That is out. Because in England, the queen, the thing has evolved from the king being absolute to the queen being a figurehead. Mm-hmm. You understand?
So it's a state.
All right. So we can't talk about what the society was in 1500. We're not living in 1500. We're not living in 1925. We're living in 2008. And as we go along, we see some concrete proposals are in place to do certain things. How do we decide whether to support those things or to not support those things? We have to understand these principles, because in all the proposals that are on the table contain these concepts in some combination, right? And therefore, how do you make the decision about which proposals to support and which to oppose? The simple one being AFRICOM, the military command in Africa, for example, where you're being told this is a wonderful thing to help Africans. You understand? How do you make the decision whether it is a wonderful thing for Africa or not? You have to understand these concepts.
Well, let's not exhaust them on one day, because we have three more classes for the first installment, and then we'll talk about the other installment,
Yeah.
because we'll take, it's maybe in the fall we're going to do it, but this is the first of the 4 lecture series. It will be Wednesday next, and then Monday again, and then Wednesday next week. And don't forget about Paul Coates' son doing book signing. And don't forget town meeting on South Africa. If you go to South Africa, unless you go painted white, you would be killed. And why? We want to know why. We march for South Africa, and so come to the town meeting. And again, my uncle, thank you very, very much.